Well, hey everyone, I'm so glad that you are with us today for this important conversation on what is happening with the church. And there's no one better to have this conversation with than Tony Morgan. Tony, thanks so much for being with us.
Dan, it's great to be with you. It's great to be with all of you as well.
Awesome. Tony, hey, tell us a little bit about yourself for those that are watching that don't know you, and tell us what gets you out of bed in the morning.
Yeah, so my journey through ministry goes back now, gosh, more than 20, 25 years, I guess, and had the opportunity to work with a couple of great churches through those years, including a stint at New Spring Church for several years, helping them get their multi-site strategy launched. But it's been, I guess, 11, 12 years ago, launched what has become the Unstuck group. And I think what really has driven me to take this step and now to, as you asked, what prompts me to get out of bed every morning, it's interesting. I think some people would actually refer to this as a real calling, but I can recall the earliest days of my relationship with Jesus. And by the way, I accepted Christ as a high school student.
Awesome.
So I remember what life was like before I had a relationship with Christ. And I certainly know the change that Jesus has made in my life. And then going forward, how that has impacted my marriage, my parenting, my purpose, my mission that God's called me to. And there's just no doubt about it. I look back to my early days of my faith, and for whatever reason, God put into me a passion for the local church, and I can't explain it. And back then, I didn't know what to do with it. And it took many years for me to finally recognize this is what God was calling me to. But there's no doubt about it. That's what drives me. And that's why I'm so encouraged too by the opportunities we have at the Unstuck group. I mean, over these last 11 years or so, we've had the opportunity now to serve on the ground with over 500 churches.
Wow.
And even in the last 6-7 months of this crazy COVID season, we've had the opportunity to engage virtually now with over 50 churches.
Wow.
And I'm telling you, that has been a phenomenal experience, hopefully for the churches that we're serving, but certainly for me and for my team as well, because we're learning so much about what's working and what's not working for churches during this season too. So I'm looking forward, though, to unpacking some of those learnings in our conversation.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks so much for being with us. You know, it seems like it's every day that I see a new article about what's going on in the church, specifically about churches that are plateauing, declining. The statistics about closing churches in America is incredible. You work with so many churches around the country. What's really happening? What's really going on with the church? Sort of cut through that data, if you will, and tell us what's happening with the church.
Yeah. So a few years ago, I finally released a book. I struggle with branding, I guess. So everything's unstuck, or I'm a genius with branding. I don't know. So the book was called The Unstuck Church, and in conjunction with the book, we launched a free assessment that's still available on our website. And since the release of that assessment, we've had over 15,000 churches take it.
Wow.
And what has been eye-opening, sometimes in a good day, hopeful for me, sometimes on a bad day, maybe a little bit discouraging, is just when you look at the results. And these are churches, we're not telling them. There are 7 phases in the life cycle of the church that I wrote about in the Unstuck Church. And these churches, all 15,000, have taken this assessment and self-identified based on the questions that we're asking, where they land on the life cycle. And as a result of that, what we know is 85% of churches self-identified that they were on the declining side of the church life cycle.
Wow.
And of those 85% of churches, the largest number, 60% of churches, 6 out of 10 churches, identified in what we call the maintenance phase of that church life cycle. And, you know, Dan, it's interesting, and you can dig into the book. The assessment itself will also highlight some of these characteristics. And again, there are 7 phases, and the characteristics of stuckness look a little bit different for all 7 of those phases. And as a result of that, what churches need to do as far as next steps that they need to engage to get unstuck look a little bit different for
Sure.
each of those 7
Sure.
phases. But what it speaks to is there's an opportunity for us
Yeah.
because if 85% of churches acknowledged we're stuck in some regard, we're not able to carry out the mission God's called us to as effectively as we had hoped. There's some opportunity for us then to take some next steps so that our churches can return to sustained health, which is ultimately what we're trying to help churches accomplish.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, so my takeaway from that the headline is most churches in America are stuck, right? Most churches, I mean, 85% plateauing or declining. That's extraordinary. And so for those that are listening and watching, you get a sense of how significant and profound the challenge is that the church is facing today. So, all right, lots of churches, 85% that are stuck. What's the number one reason? I mean, obviously, I'm sure there's lots of reasons with all these churches, but if you boil it down, what's the number one factor or reason that churches get stuck?
Yeah, so again, we're seeing churches land in all 7 phases of this life cycle. But as I just mentioned, the most common phase that they get stuck in is in the maintenance phase, 60% of churches. And what we see is in those churches that are stuck in that place, the most common factor, and it's by far, is that they over time have become more insider focused. And it's interesting. I mean, what we see is churches don't naturally drift towards health. And as a result of that, too, one of the reasons why they don't is because they don't naturally drift towards trying to engage people outside the church and outside the faith. And it honestly doesn't take very long
Wow.
for people to start gathering at a church. And before you know it, most of the ministry strategy, most of the ministry environments, most of the focus turns toward people who are already connected to the church. And in most cases, they're already connected to the faith as well.
Right.
And so, Dan, by far, this is the biggest challenge that we're
Wow.
seeing churches needing to overcome. And am I saying that churches need to pivot from being completely insider focused to becoming completely outsider focused? Absolutely not. But we do need to figure out how do we bring a better balance to that so that our desire to disciple believers and our desire to engage in the Great Commission
Yeah.
and for us to be reaching people outside the faith and outside the church, how do we bring better balance to that? And so, bottom line, the primary reason why we see churches getting stuck is because the way that they do church becomes more important than why they do church.
Man.
And
Wow.
I say that because the why should be about the Great Commission. It should be about reaching, making new disciples, and encouraging those new disciples to take their next steps toward Jesus. And unfortunately, the way we do church, what our ministry strategies look like, beginning with what our Sunday morning experiences look like, they start to be shaped by who we have already reached rather than the person we're trying to engage with the gospel message. So
Yeah.
I would
Wow.
argue just being insider focused is the primary reason why we're finding churches are getting stuck.
Yeah, wow, that's incredible, and I just keep thinking about the Great Commission as you mentioned, and how counter the Great Commission is to being so inward focused, and so for many of our folks that are watching, a lot of the leaders that are engaged in this conversation that we're having. Many of them, I'm sure, are stuck. Whether they're stuck as a leader, they're stuck leading their church is stuck. What should they do? What steps should they take, or what's the number one thing they should do to help get unstuck?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned leadership. I think leadership is definitely a key focus that we need to leverage if we're going to get unstuck moving forward. And I mean, I think it begins with us acknowledging the leadership gift in our churches. And certainly scripture speaks to this in a number of places. Namely, I'm thinking about Romans 12:8 and 1 Corinthians 12:28, but there are a number of passages that speak to leadership in the context of a church. And I find it interesting in most churches, I think this would be true, is for whatever reason, in all of the other areas of giftedness, think about prayer or helps or healing or mercy or generosity or evangelism and all of these other areas of giftedness, I think churches really are trying to empower people to leverage those gifts to carry out not only purpose in the individual's life, but to accomplish the mission of the body of Christ that God's called us to. But for whatever reason, and I'm not sure what the underlying issue is, when it comes to the leadership gift, our tendency as churches for some reason is to control rather than empower. And I'm not sure what's driving that. And what the way we see that becoming evident in churches is around poor governance, large boards, a lot of committees trying to make sure the right decisions are made by the right people, a lot of congregational votes that try to limit rather than empower leaders. And I will even take this a step further. I have found, for whatever reason, in the churches that we're working with, that commonly we think we need to pay people to use their leadership gift rather than acknowledging there are a lot of people in our church that have that leadership gift. The vast majority of them that are in lay roles or volunteer roles. And I think as churches, we need to do a better job of not just engaging people doing ministry, but we need to help people actually empower people to use that leadership gift to accomplish ministry as well. And it's interesting, a couple of times we've dug into some data kind of comparing stuck churches and healthy churches, declining churches and growing churches. And believe it or not, it's this leadership quotient that is actually the defining of all of the data that we look at, the most significant difference between stuck churches and healthy churches. So as an example, what we found in the data is in churches that are stuck, commonly there's one leader for every 20 people in attendance, close to 1 to 20. In healthy churches, growing churches, thriving churches, the data showed it was closer to one leader for every 10 people in attendance.
Wow.
So almost twice as many leaders.
Wow.
That helped get a smaller span of care, which means we have one leader trying to encourage, equip, disciple, mentor smaller groups of people. And as a result of that, the data would suggest anyways, it's helping churches get healthier, it's helping them thrive, it's helping them grow and reach more people. And so there's something about this leadership, leadership characteristic in churches that really is defining the stuck churches and the healthy churches.
Yeah, that's so good. I'm sure many people that are watching today who are leading stuck churches, they're trying to figure out, what to do. And I think what you shared could be a great place for them to start. And it's to really think about what's our leadership pipeline look like? What's our systems for developing and training leaders? At Sandals Church, we talk about the role of paid staff is to recruit, equip, empower, and release others for the work of ministry. Less being a player, more being a coach. That's the paid role. And I think, again, for many that are watching today, that may be the thing that helps to get them on a journey to being healthy and not unstuck. All right, so some are watching now that are struggling, that are stuck, and they're listening to what you're sharing. They're listening to the data. They've probably never thought about it before, but maybe they are right now, and they're asking, is my church stuck? And so what are the signs, and what would you say to those folks that are thinking, hey, maybe we are stuck, maybe we are struggling. What are the signs, Tony, of a stuck church?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I find that there are two types of stuck churches. There's a healthy stuck church and there's an unhealthy stuck church. And for healthy churches, and you can think again, these are churches that are growing, they're thriving, they're moving towards sustained health. It's interesting though, we get a lot of calls from churches that they're certainly healthy. We would agree that they're healthy, but they feel like they're stuck. And what we see is that healthy churches tend to get stuck around issues related to scaling growth. And so it's things like shifting ministry strategy to make, and then making sure that our structures support that ministry strategy. And in recent days, I've had conversations with churches looking at their multi-site strategy, and they're feeling stuck around that, even though if you were to look at them from the outside looking in, you would say this is a healthy church.
Wow.
Healthy churches reaching out to us in recent days around how to engage a more effective digital ministry strategy. The structure piece, though, is key, we find, for healthy churches that get stuck, because as churches experience growth, commonly there needs to be some pivots related to structure and how we're empowering different levels of leadership in a growing organization so that the church can continue to experience growth and an increase in kingdom impact. So those tend to be the issues for healthy stuck churches. For unhealthy stuck churches, I find that the common issues tend to be around core issues or foundational issues. So let me give you some examples of what we see. Lack of mission and vision. That tends to be an issue for unhealthy stuck churches. Not having a clear spiritual formation path. So not having clarity about how we're going to encourage people to take their next steps toward Jesus. As I mentioned earlier, they tend to be inward focused. And so they're lacking an outreach strategy with that in mind. Weak leadership. So that's something we just talked about.
Yeah.
They're not empowering leaders. And here's just kind of a sidebar indication of this. Again, looking at the data, we found, and this seems counterintuitive maybe, but declining churches that are in decline have larger church boards, and they have twice as many committees as healthy growing churches.
Wow.
And so again, it's just an indication that we're not empowering leaders in unhealthy stuck churches. And then the last common factor that we see is complexity. And complexity comes in many different forms. It's complexity around ministry programming. It's complexity around the ministry calendar. That leads to complexity around communications, complexity around decision making. How do we get decisions made, and therefore decisions don't get made? So there are just a number of complexity factors we find too in the churches that are unhealthy stuck. But that's the key thing. The key takeaway maybe here, Dan, is that there are actually two types of stuckness. There's a healthy stuckness that we see in churches, and there's also an unhealthy stuckness that we're trying to overcome so that churches can return to sustained health.
That's great. Yeah, I think complexity kills churches. That's such a great point that you made around complexity. I think so often churches get complex because they're trying to satisfy everyone. Everyone wants their ministry, their idea to move forward, but ultimately that really causes the church to struggle because they lack focus, right? When you're super wide with lots of ideas, lots of ministries, you become complex, as you said, and you really lack focus at the end of the day. And it seems like, thinking of Apple, I'm thinking of In-N-Out for all of those of you that have been to the West Coast and had an In-N-Out burger and you've looked at their menu, it's one thing, and it's burgers, right? You think about Apple, they got 6 or 7 products. Seems like they're doing okay, right? They've gotten rid of complexity and they've stayed simple and focused. That's great.
Dan, I don't want to start a war, but here in Atlanta, we tend to favor Chick-fil-A sandwiches over In-N-Out burgers.
Well, I'm a little torn. I've lived on the East Coast and the West Coast, and I'm a Chick-fil-A guy too, so I get it. Let's talk about some good news, right? Have you experienced churches that have gotten unstuck? Are there any success stories? What can you tell us about any stories of churches getting unstuck?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we've worked with hundreds of churches, and part of what we do to make sure we retain health as a ministry group trying to support churches is we're constantly getting feedback and doing kind of like customer satisfaction surveys with our churches, not right after we engage with them, but months after we've engaged with them to see how they're doing and just learn what's happening. And so, yes, there are lots of stories like that, but I'll share the most recent one I heard. This is from a church in the Southeast. And over a 7 or 8 year period through 2015, it was a decline. I mean, you could just look at the numbers and year over year over year, they were seeing decline. And over that period of time, they lost 700 people. Wow. And so this is a church that at their peak was about 2,400 in attendance. And in that relatively short time frame, they lost over 700 people in attendance. And then we started to engage with them in 2015, initially doing just some coaching with the staff leadership. And then ultimately they went through the full Unstuck process, which includes a health assessment, strategic planning, ministry planning for the future, and then looking at the structure piece too, to make sure that their staffing is aligned with their ministry strategy. And I just heard back from the pastor last week, and he was pretty excited because in these recent years now, they've seen a 20% increase again in attendance. And, these days we're talking a lot about a V-shaped recovery, and this church has actually seen it. And some of that health has been related to the structure conversations that we were able to have with them. Some of it was more about their strategy and specific to them, their multi-site strategy. And it sounds like similar to Sandals Church, they had merged with some churches. They had tried to launch some new campuses. As they got into multi-site, they ran into some challenges. And we were able to help kind of coach and point them in a new direction. And for them, it's paid off. But I will say, we can do all the coaching, we can do all the counseling we can. At the end of the day, though, it's still up to the leadership of that church. Amen. And they really invested in the process. And as a result of that, they're starting to see some of the fruit.
That's great. That's great. Thanks for sharing that story. Let's talk about church mergers for a second. You mentioned that in that story. At Sandals Church, we've done 9 church mergers over the last 5 years. There are lots of folks leading churches that are watching this right now. They're stuck. They're struggling. Perhaps they've been struggling for many years. They're getting to a place where they're not sure what to do. Why should some of these churches consider a church merger? What have you learned about church mergers, and why should some of the folks that are listening consider that? Because it's a huge deal, right? If you're a pastor, you're a board member, you're responsible for that church body, for the building perhaps. And so releasing that to another church and becoming part of this other church is a huge decision. So why church mergers?
Yeah, so let me just begin. Jim Tomberlin, who is now part of our team at the Unstuck group, he's kind of one of the leading voices when it comes to mergers in the church. Jim was at a great church in Colorado Springs for a number of years, then joined the team at Willow Creek Community Church in the Chicagoland area. Now he's a part-time kind of a chief of staff role at Christ Fellowship in Miami.
Okay.
But several years ago, with Warren Bird from the Leadership Network at that time, the two of them released this book called Better Together, and they just refreshed this book, and the refreshed version just came out in the last couple of months. It's all about making church mergers work. And so if you are even thinking about the possibility of pursuing mergers or merging with another church, you really need to start by reading that book, because included in that book, the Unstuck group did quite a bit of research to learn what's working and what's not working around all the mergers that we're seeing across the country. And so that's a great foundational resource for you to consider. But I will say, Dan, there seem to be these two common factors that we find related to successful mergers, and they're both probably pretty obvious, but the fact that some mergers are successful and some are not suggests that some churches aren't following through with what might be very obvious. And so the first one is this: for a merger to be successful, there has to be at least one healthy church in that merger.
Yep.
And I just can't tell you how many times, either after the fact or before a merger happened and churches were considering it, they were two struggling churches trying to come together, thinking if they merge together somehow, that's going to produce health and that would allow them to sustain their ministry. And again, I mean, it would be like two people that are dating and they're both dysfunctional.
Yeah.
It's not a healthy relationship. And they think somehow getting married is going to make their relationship healthy. That would never work. And we have found it never works with church mergers either. So there has to be at least one healthy church if a merger is going to be successful.
Yeah.
And again, similar to the marriage analogy that I just referenced, what we found is, in marriages, if the marriage is going to be healthy, usually it begins with some marriage counseling on the front end. I mean, I would guess, especially for all the church leaders that are watching today, they would advocate, if you're going to get married, you should go through some biblical marriage counseling before you get married.
Amen.
But you would be amazed at how many mergers, again, we usually get called after the fact when they have struggled. They didn't obtain any counseling before they went through the merger process. And so that again seems to be another common factor that we find related to the difference between successful and unsuccessful mergers. And so, I mean, if there are churches are watching today and you want help from folks that have done this many, many times before, you can reach out to us. It's theunstuckgroup.com/mergers.
Okay.
And on that website, a lot of information that might be helpful for you without contacting us. But if you need that counsel before you go through that process, please reach out to us.
That's great. Yeah, early on in our church merger journey, we read Jim's book, Better Together, and it was so fantastic. It's a great roadmap, I'd say, for larger churches that are healthy, that are considering doing church mergers and church adoptions. Man, go get that book. It's such an incredible resource. So thanks to Jim and Warren for putting that together. Just a great resource. We have found that church mergers are a great way for a church to move forward and continue the legacy of all of those folks 10 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago that invested so much to get the church to where it is today, for that legacy to continue and ultimately to reach that community and become a thriving, healthy church again, is through a church merger. It's such a better option than selling that property and it becoming a 7-Eleven or whatever the case may be. So I want to encourage all those that are watching, both larger, healthy churches to consider church mergers, and also those that are really struggling and stuck churches to maybe reach out to a church in your community that you think you could partner with and perhaps become a part of. All right, well, let's pivot and let's talk a post-COVID, post-quarantine world. What will make the difference in some churches thriving and some churches ultimately dying and closing? What will be the difference maker? And then any thoughts you have on what a new normal looks like for the future of the church?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm confident there will be a post-COVID. So that might be the best thing you heard all day long.
There you go.
Eventually, there's
Thank you,
going
Tony.
to be an end to
You're a
this.
man
The
of
question,
hope.
of course, is how long, how many
Right.
months before we're back to whatever the new normal is going to look like, I guess. Just a couple weeks ago, let me just say this, though. I was hearing an interview on NPR with David Kinnaman from the Barna Group. And in that interview, David mentioned, looking at the data he's looking at today, 1 in 5 churches is likely to close within the last 18 months, within the next 18 months. And as I was hearing that stat, I was thinking, well, you know what? I can see that. Because that stat's pretty consistent with the percentage of churches that we're seeing are on life support after they take the Unstuck Church assessment as well. And my next thought was, what we've experienced over the last 7 or 8 months is going to change the direction that stuck church is heading, so that magically they're going to return to health. If anything, I think what we've experienced in these last 7 or 8 months is only going to accelerate some of the challenges that churches are facing. And as a result of that, I think it's a great opportunity for us to step back, acknowledge together what we did pre-COVID was causing stuckness. What we've experienced in the last 7 or 8 months, if anything, is probably accelerating what we were experiencing. If we want to get on the other side of this and not only experience health as a church, but be more effective in the mission God's called us to, we need to take this moment right now and consider, what are the changes that God's calling us to as a ministry? And so that's what we're seeing, and what I would argue are the healthy churches in this season. They're not waiting for normal to come back. They're actually looking in this season at the changes, the pivots that they need to make, so that when the new normal returns, they're in a stronger position to engage the mission God has called us to. And let me just give you one example. I won't name the church, but you get those lists of the fastest growing and the largest churches around the country. This was a conversation I was having with the leader of one of those churches. And this was the statement that he made. For years, we just opened our doors on Sunday morning and new people would show up. The statement he made was this: we can't wait for our community to come to us anymore. We have to begin to go to our community.
Amen.
And it was an acknowledgement that they're recognizing in this season, they're not just waiting for COVID to end and for people to come back. They're trying to figure out how to engage their community. And so what we're encouraging churches to do is to think about these 3 strategic areas for a post-COVID world. And all of them relate to, how do we engage people outside the church and outside the faith? And the reason I say that is, most churches that get stuck, I alluded to it earlier, it's not because they aren't doing discipleship, they're not helping believers take their next steps toward Christ. The main reason why churches get stuck is because they become inward focused. And so the 3 areas that we're really challenging churches to consider is, how can we mobilize our church so that individuals are engaging relationship and encouraging people to take a step toward Jesus in their neighborhoods, in their workplaces, at the ball fields? In other words, it's personal evangelism, but somehow we need to figure out how to mobilize our church. The second area is around our weekend services. I just got some new data, and more than half of the churches that responded to this statement said that's our church. And the statement was this: our weekend service is designed for somebody who already has a faith in Jesus.
Wow.
And over half of the churches that responded said, we agree with that statement.
Wow.
Less than a quarter of the churches disagreed with that statement. And so what it highlights for me is that our weekend services are primarily designed for people that already have a relationship with Jesus Christ. And if that's the case, number one, I would challenge you to consider, is that God's design for the weekend service? And the reason I ask that is because when I look particularly at Paul's writing in 1 Corinthians, I think it's chapter 14, he's talking in that passage about speaking in tongues. But he's acknowledging when we gather together in our meetings, not only are there going to be believers, but there are also going to be unbelievers. And so what it suggests to me is there needs to be some intentionality about how we design our gatherings, our meetings, so that we're remembering it's not just the believers that we're encouraging to take a next step, but we should be expecting unbelievers to be with us as well and encouraging them to take their next steps toward Jesus as well. So that's the second area. And then the third area, and you've heard a lot about this in recent months, is related to digital ministry. And somehow I think the church needs to come to the realization, I thought maybe COVID finally pushed us off the cliff, but somehow we have to come to the realization that the internet is with us. It's going to stay. It's not going away. And actually, most of the people that we're trying to reach who are currently outside the faith and outside the church are using it. Amen. They're on Facebook, they're on Twitter, they're on Instagram, they're on TikTok, at least for a while here in the US, they're on TikTok. And so we have to figure out, how are we going to engage people who are outside the church and outside the faith, leveraging our digital ministry strategies. And here's what's alarming. Here we are 7 to 8 months in. And again, the recent data that we just looked at, it was about 4 out of 5 churches that acknowledged we don't really have a digital ministry strategy to reach people outside the church and outside the faith.
Wow.
And of the churches that did say they had a strategy, less than half of those churches have any way to monitor whether that strategy is actually working.
Wow.
That's data that we just collected in recent weeks.
Wow.
And so it's highlighting for us in each of these 3 areas, but maybe particularly in this third area around how as churches we're engaging people online using digital ministry strategies. We have a lot of work to do. And I think all 3 of those areas are going to be critical to how we're going to engage the mission God's called us to in a post-COVID world.
Yeah. Man, that's fantastic, Tony. My hope is that many of those that are watching, that are leading churches, would gather their teams up and go back and rewatch this interview. And even if they just parked in this part of our conversation and talk about those 3 areas that are so crucial to churches thriving into the future, and really start laying some plans there. I think that's a great way for churches to get unstuck and maybe to move from being unhealthy to being healthy. That's fantastic. Thank you. You know, we themed this conference around this idea of agility, and agility is seeing and delivering change. Change and leadership to me are synonymous. And for many churches to really make it through COVID and get to the other side and be healthy, I think the difference maker is going to be the willingness to change. You talked earlier about releasing control. Many churches are either going to make it or not make it based on, are they willing to release control? For some people, it may be releasing their job or their role on a board or as a senior pastor, or they're willing to change the style of music. And so my hope is that church leaders that are watching, churches that are struggling, that are stuck, will really be thinking about change and how to deliver change to their church in these months and years ahead. All right, look, we're all changing and evolving. That's the hope, at least. So how has your perspective changed since the onset of COVID? I got a couple of questions here I'm going to pack together. How has your definition of stuck changed between February, when the virus hit and the quarantine hit, and today? How has your definition of stuck changed over these last 6 or 7 months? What are you saying to stuck leaders today that you weren't saying back in February? And what were you saying then that you now consider irrelevant or outdated because the world has changed so much? So a handful of questions about changes and shifts through COVID.
Yeah. Honestly, it feels like I'm giving some of these same answers over and over again, but mainly because it feels like I'm living Groundhog Day over and over again. It feels like I've lived 6 months, and this has lasted like 6 decades in
Right.
some ways.
Yeah, sure.
Uh, it's interesting. I would say pre-COVID, post-COVID, mid-COVID. Again, conversation, commonly the issues that get churches stuck, it's still the same issue. They're still the same issues. This is the caveat I would acknowledge, though. We talk about kind of these 3 tiers of what brings alignment for organizations. There's a foundational tier, there's a directional tier, and then there's an action tier. The foundation, what can bring us confidence, I think it's things for churches like our theology, our doctrine, the mission that God's called us to. Really, we might talk about those things differently, we might use different language, but those things never change. And in a season when there's a lot, it feels like change is happening daily. I think it actually gives us confidence, particularly as pastors, that our mission is the same, the doctrine is the same, God's word is the same, none of that changes. What does need to change? It's that middle tier, though. It's the direction of where we're headed. And the direction includes things like our vision for the future, the ministry strategies that we engage, the wins, how we define the goals for where we're heading in the future. These things in this season, I'm absolutely confident we need to be making changes, particularly as churches, in these directional characteristics of who we are as churches. And again, commonly, one of the reasons why churches get stuck is they treat these directions, the vision, the ministry strategies, the wins, the goals of ministry, they treat those as if they're part of the foundation. In other words, once they've established vision, once they've established strategy, that never changes.
Wow, that's great.
If you do that, you will get stuck.
Yeah, there you go.
As a church, and it's just a matter of time. And so the biggest thing in this season that I'm encouraging churches to do is step back and assess where are we today, what's working, what's not, and then what are the next steps, where do we need to go moving forward, and to really have some concentrated conversation about those directional pieces. Because again, what we've experienced in these last months, it's not going to help us get to health. We have to figure out how we respond to what we've experienced in recent months. Otherwise, all we've experienced is just going to continue to accelerate change. And for a lot of churches, like we started in the beginning of this conversation, that's just going to accelerate the unhealthiness that they've been experiencing.
Yeah, man, so good. All right, let's wrap up with the last question. I think about this often myself. If you had a megaphone and could speak to every pastor, every elder, every board of directors, every church member, right now, here we are in 2020, what would you say, Tony? You've got a megaphone, you've got millions of people listening. What's the one thing that you would say?
Yeah, this may sound crazy coming from somebody who kind of is a pastor, has been in ministry for so long, and is speaking to, I'm assuming today, speaking to a lot of pastors and church leaders. This may sound like, what is this what the last thing you wanted to share? But this is it. As far as I know, Jesus is the only answer.
Mm.
And the reason I want to emphasize that at the end is, especially what I've seen in the last number of months, there are a lot of things that are grabbing our culture's attention, and I would argue have started to grab the attention of churches too. Think about politics. Sometimes that is the answer, or social issues, or ways that we're trying to engage what's happening in the world around us. And yes, the church needs to speak to all of these things. But at the end of the day, Jesus is the only answer.
Mm.
And what I've learned is when anything becomes louder than the gospel message,
Mm.
then the church starts to decline and they start to move towards stuckness. And
Mm.
I've seen it happen in a lot of churches. And so, yes, we have to speak to the challenges in the world around us, especially where they apply to the individual, the person that we're trying to reach with the gospel message. But we have to make sure that the loudest thing that we're talking about is the good news that
Amen.
that Jesus has overcome death, he's overcome sin. He really is our only hope. He's the only thing that's going to provide, he's the only person that's going to provide our purpose, our forgiveness. We have to make sure that that message stays louder than anything else that we talk about. Otherwise, for churches, you will begin to take a step toward decline and ultimately death. And so, again, I hope that you receive that as encouragement. I
Yeah.
know I need to be reminded of
Yeah.
that daily. And really, you started to talk about at the very front of this conversation, what gets you out of bed every day? It's that. I still have siblings. I still have other family members. I still have neighbors
Mm.
that don't yet have a relationship with Jesus.
Yeah.
And that's what drives me to help churches, to help organizations have a greater kingdom impact. And so that's the last thing I would have to
That's
share,
awesome.
Dan, as
That's
we
great.
talk about how do we pivot? How do we
Yeah.
embrace change? Let's just make sure as we do that, we're keeping Jesus, the gospel message, louder than anything else that we're talking about.
Fantastic. Tony, that's so good. Let's close with a bonus question. You're a Chick-fil-A guy, so spicy Chick-fil-A or regular Chick-fil-A? What's your vote?
You know, for a guy that embraces change, I like the original Chick-fil-A sandwich.
Really? Okay. I love it as well, but I've moved over to spicy, to be honest with you. So, Tony, thank you so much for being with us today. Those that are watching, that are struggling, that are stuck, either as a leader, a pastor, or a church, and they want help, what's the best way for them to reach out and to connect with you and the team?
It's very kind of you to ask that question. You can reach out to us at the unstuckgroup.com.
Awesome. Tony, I just want to thank you for being with us. You shared so much wisdom and so much of your experience. It's going to be incredible for our listeners and those that are watching to help get unstuck. We really appreciate you. And for all those that are watching, we're so glad that you could be with us today, and we will see you next time.